All right, we're going to go ahead. We'll get going because it is 7 o'clock on my watch. Welcome to what is the last Wonk Wednesday of the year. So time flies. But welcome from the Public Policy Center. I am David Swartnam, I'm a professor of environmental engineering and also the head of the Environmental Policy Research Program at PPC. I want to put in a couple of plugs first and foremost. So this Saturday, if you're interested in climate, we are going to be organizing the World Climate Simulation. So it is an opportunity for participants, it's open to the public, to essentially role play the negotiations associated with the Paris Climate Accord. And so we will, if you sign up to participate, and you can learn more at our website where all of our events are listed for public policy, you can register to attend. You will be arriving on Saturday at 1 to this same location. You'll be assigned a part in the role playing, and you will work on achieving the 2 degrees Celsius warming goal set forth by Paris. And so it's a highly interactive experience. I think it's going to be something that's pretty unique and enjoyable, something that we wanted to do to help celebrate Earth Day, which is on Sunday. So if you're interested, seek myself out or Leslie Gannon in the back. We have a few flyers that we can give you with a link to sign up. We hope to see some of you there. Without any further ado, I am very delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Silvia Secchi, who is a professor through the Public Policy Center, but also appointed in the Department of Geographical and Sustainability Sciences. Silvia has a PhD in economics from Iowa State University, and she studies the economics and policy associated with our natural resources. She is an expert when it comes to the impacts of agriculture on the environment. She is also very well known for her work related to biofuels and the RFS. In fact, I think you were speaking on that last night. So this is a return engagement. She's essentially holding court at the public library this week.
I'll be back on Saturday.
She spoke last night on the RFS. She's speaking tonight on the Paris Climate Accord. And then on Saturday, she will be playing a very special role as a fossil fuel lobbyist in our role-playing event. And so she'll get to see both sides of the spectrum. Before coming to the University of Iowa this fall, she was a professor at the University of Southern Illinois, and we are very lucky to have her here. She is incredibly sharp, incredibly insightful. I love my interactions with her through PPC and over coffee and any other venue for that matter. I'm delighted that she's here to speak with you all. Help me welcome Silvia Secchi.
So feel free to interrupt and ask questions. My MO is I have always more slides than I need. I still have like imposter syndrome, so I always feel that I need to be super prepared. So but if we don't get through everything, that's fine. I want to talk about a couple of things today. I want to talk about how the Paris Agreement works and how it's different from its predecessor, the Kyoto Protocol. How the United States would have implemented the Paris Agreement, and how subnational units can contribute to the agreement. And then if we get to that, how can people contribute to the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, okay? So the Paris Agreement has now been signed by 195 countries. It got in and entered into force earlier. It needed a minimum of 55 parties. The way it works is that parties that join the agreement prepare intended national actions, essentially, these INDCs, the way in which they are going to implement the agreement. And so you can see that there's only 3 countries that have not prepared documents. And the rest have already presented a plan as to how they are going to meet those greenhouse gas emission reductions, okay? That's us. We're the only one that intends to withdraw from the agreement, and we're pretty much the only nation that's going to be left out when that happens, okay? It's going to take some time. How is the Paris Agreement different from Kyoto? Well, for one thing, Paris seems to be working in terms of bridging the gap between developing countries and developed countries. That was the big issue with Kyoto and one of the main reasons why it failed. Kyoto was more prescriptive in how it asked nations to meet greenhouse gas emission reductions. It had left less latitude to countries. Essentially, the big problem with Kyoto was that if you were an Annex I country, you had to reduce emissions, and the developed countries wanted China and India and other newly industrialized and industrializing countries to become Annex I countries and reduce their emissions. And that was very problematic because most of the problem has been caused historically by Annex I or rich countries. Most of the growth of the problem in the near future is going to be caused by non-Annex I or developing countries. If you look up there, the growth in emissions is coming not from OECD countries, those are flat, it's coming from industrializing countries. Okay, so if we want to do something, we have to address these rising emissions, but to bring them under the cap of the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions was proving to be very problematic, and so ultimately Kyoto failed. So Paris is a truly French agreement in that it's much more laissez-faire. In which sense? Every country in Paris has a national target, but the target is self-determined. The modalities, the policies, the tools that will be used to achieve this national target are also left to the individual countries, okay? How much and how it's done, okay, it's left to individual countries. What the agreement does is it sets up tools for oversight, monitoring, and verification. So if Brazil says we are going to reduce deforestation by 5%, there's going to be tools to monitor whether that's really happening. There are no real teeth to the agreement as of now. So if Brazil doesn't do it, there's not very much that the international community can do. It's based on an honors system, essentially. Okay. So this intended national action, okay, these things that countries are going to do, I'm going to show you the wide range of things that are allowed under the agreement, okay? You can have targets to reduce greenhouse gases. You can have targets not that are for something else, for example, increasing renewable energy and not directly related to greenhouse gases. You can have actions specifically. So instead of saying that you're going to increase your renewables by 50%, you can just say you're going to build a big dam, okay? Or you can have combinations. So there is a wide range of things that can be done and still be participating in the agreement, okay? So let me give you some examples of how it works. If you have actions, so these can be policies, so they can be countrywide policies, or they can be specific projects. So you could have, as I said, a geothermal project, a wind project. You could have the implementation of something equivalent to the EPA STAR program at the national level, okay? And then, as I said, you could have greenhouse gas emission outcomes or non-GHG outcomes, so renewable energy. Okay, so these are real examples of what countries have already prepared for the agreement. So you see Ethiopia is proposing to increase hydropower capacity. Some of this is contentious for other reasons, but essentially they're going to increase the number of projects that increase their renewable energy generation. Policy level, Madagascar, the RED policy is a UN-sanctioned policy to promote forest conservation and reduce forest degradation. So Madagascar is doing something at the country level to reduce deforestation. The Cook Islands have a non-greenhouse gas outcome. They are going to move completely to renewable energy, okay, which hopefully is going to have some relationship with their greenhouse gas emissions. The Europeans and Russia have a base year emission target. So you see they pick 1990 as their base year, which is the year where emissions were quite high. So your reductions are not going to cost you very much. This also is discretionary. So I'll show you maps. The countries are picking the dates they want, okay? So they're essentially deciding, they're self-determining how much they want to invest in this. Fixed level targets, so this is not a percentage reduction. They just want to become carbon neutral, which means that for any emissions that they put out, they're going to have some kind of sink, right? So if they're still burning coal, they're going to plant trees to offset those emissions. And Paris allows for trade, so they could achieve carbon neutrality by participating in a market. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Intensity targets, typically intensity targets are per unit of GDP, gross domestic product. So for every dollar in the economy that comes out, you are going to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, okay? Greenhouse gas emissions per unit of gross domestic product. And you see these levels, this base year is, again, determined by the country. The target year is, again, determined by the country, okay? Baseline scenario targets. So this is assuming that this is what you were doing without the policy, is this increase in greenhouse gases, and you're going to achieve a reduction from that baseline that particular year. So there is a wide variety of things that people can do, and Brazil, for example, is doing a combination of these. This is to show you on a map that greenhouse gas targets are chosen by the majority of countries, but not all countries are doing that. This is particularly important for developing countries. For example, the fact that China is choosing a greenhouse target and non-greenhouse target, it's something that makes sense for them. Same for India because of their increase in industrialization. Okay. How they decide in terms of baseline, intensity, trajectory, again, this is left to individual countries, a wide variety of choices. The countries that have non-greenhouse gas target types, they can choose renewable energy, energy efficiency. They can focus on forestry. This is, again, particularly important for some developing countries that are dependent on wood and their forest resources. For developing countries, there are two options. The developing countries can make commitments that are unconditional. So they're going to do it regardless. Or they can make conditional contributions. They can make conditional reductions. These depend on typically aid, and they are more ambitious. So if you are Madagascar, well, actually, Madagascar doesn't have conditional ones. Let's pick one that does. If you are India, okay, what you're saying is, I am going to do this if I receive enough aid to do it. If I don't, I won't do it. Okay? So this puts an onus on the international community to pony up some cash. Okay? And if we don't, then these countries don't have to do anything. They're not obligated. I should have said this before. Let me say it now. So when we came out of the Paris Agreement, when the White House made the statement that this was very constricting for the United States, I hope I have shown you that this is a very loosey-goosey kind of policy where people can essentially decide how you're going to meet the target, and you can decide the target as well, okay? Not just how tight the target is, but the kind of target that you want. This is, again, to show you that there's been multiple base years that we measure the reductions from. And the older the base year, essentially the easier it is to meet those targets because our carbon intensity has decreased with new technologies from the 90s. So for Russia, it's not going to be very hard to meet those obligations at all. The countries that are doing things more forcefully are using more recent years. This is the target year period. This also affects how stringent the policy is, because if you can put it off until 2035, you have more time to meet your target, right? So the closer the target year, the harder it's going to be, the more work you have to do to meet the obligations. This is also very important. In Kyoto, there were some countries that were outside the cap of emissions, but there were also some sectors that were outside the cap. So forestry and agriculture were outside the cap. They were presumed zero emitters. They were not considered to be putting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They could participate in terms of selling credits. They could do more than they were doing. And so if you were the forest sector in Canada and you had a new forest project, you could sell the greenhouse gas emission reductions associated with afforestation, for example, okay? So in Paris, in the Paris Agreement, countries have the choice. They had the choice to decide whether they wanted to have land use change and forestry, this is what the acronym stands for, within their goals or not. Or they could pick something in between. Maybe forestry is in and agriculture is out. Maybe one form of land use change, grassland conversion to agriculture is in, and the other ones are out. So again, very, very broad flexibility. The other thing that countries had flexibility on is what greenhouse gases were to be included in their target. You might have heard about methane. You know, methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. It's associated or not. There is a lot of discussion about that with fracking, for example. So you could decide partial gases. You could omit some of these. So again, this goes to show how flexible the agreement is. You could or could not choose to participate in international markets. So the countries that don't participate in international markets have to meet their obligations within their country. Countries that choose to participate in international markets can decide to keep polluting and just buy credits from somewhere else, okay? This has also been very controversial because do you know what the cheapest way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is? It's a proven, well-known technology. You don't know that?
Well, I think you told us the other day.
Okay, so what is it?
Wood.
Wood. Planting trees is the easiest way to sequester carbon. We know how to do that, right? We've done it for thousands of years. So what can happen if the cap is, the target is kind of loose, is that, you know, people, like, I'm just going to pick on a country randomly, the one where I come from, Italy. People in Italy want to keep burning coal. They just give some money to Brazil to plant trees over there. They can keep burning as much coal as they want. Their emissions are offset by the greenhouse gases captured in the forest sink in Brazil, okay? So again, in Kyoto, this was kind of like the whole idea. In the Paris Agreement, this becomes an option, but it's not mandatory. The other thing that can or cannot be included in the plans that the countries prepared is whether they consider adaptation or not. So adaptation is what we gotta do if we don't mitigate climate change, right? If the sea level rises because we're letting the temperature rise, what's going to happen is that we're gonna have more storms. You know, like when you go to the barrier islands and people have all those houses on stilts, you're gonna have to build those houses higher and higher and higher. That's adaptation. Huh? So, or you need bigger levees or, you know, all sorts of things to protect from flooding and to protect from more extreme events. So countries can decide to include adaptation in their plans or not. So the real question we should be asking about Paris is not why, oh, it's too hard for us. Is it hard enough? Is it doing anything? Okay? I would argue with you that certainly it's not doing enough, and this is from the one of the latest products that's showing essentially if we have the unconditional promises met. So if we only do what each country does without any aid, this is where the yellow, oops, I lost the red. This is where we're going with the current policies. We're going to do a little bit better, but not too much. If developed countries offer aid to developing countries, we're going to do a little bit better, but it's still well above the 2 degrees centigrade reduction that we need. So, is it useful at all? Well, I would argue that we have created an institutional framework that has succeeded in getting the whole world, except, you know, one country, which will remain nameless, to participate. So once you have the institutional setup, once you have created all those verification mechanisms, once you have all those tools to go monitor the remote sensing, to look at deforestation, once you have those things in place, it's easier to tighten. It's easier to ask for more. If nothing is there, you have to start from scratch. But I would argue that the merit of the Paris Agreement is not in how much we're doing, is in how we're doing it, and how we have managed to convince every country in the world, but one, that this is something that we need to be concerned about, okay? So that's progress, because Kyoto failed in that respect. How was the United States going to meet the obligations of the Paris Agreement? Essentially by continuing doing things that we were doing already. So for the transportation sector, was the CAFE standard that decides what the mileage is for new vintages of cars. Programs like the EPA STAR programs on the building code, energy efficiency, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the Clean Power Plan. Okay? The Clean Power Plan that was deemed constitutional in part by the Supreme Court only applies to stationary sources. So it only applies to electricity generation in practice. We could have kept driving our cars. You know, our Americans that love their SUVs would have been able to keep doing that without any changes. The Clean Power Plan itself was not particularly prescriptive in how to achieve the reductions on a state-by-state basis. There were state goals, and there was a long compliance period, and there were building blocks, okay? So these building blocks were available to each state. So if you were Illinois, for example, that uses a lot of coal plants, one way to meet the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions at the stationary sources was to improve the efficiency, the heat rate improvement of coal plants, or use more natural gas. This was actually, this is a big driver of the clean power plan itself, because a lot of this natural gas is made in the US now, right? And so we were not going to be importing the substitute for coal. This is all US resources. Natural gas is cost competitive against coal, so this was not going to cost you know, a boatload of money. Increased utilization of zero carbon resources. This, by the way, included things like ethanol, included things like biomass. So this was good for a variety of states, from the Pacific Northwest to the Midwest. And a lot of people in the environmental community were not very keen on this because they were afraid of deforestation in Oregon and Washington state. So this was not like, this was not the socialist takeover of the energy sector, let me put it that way. Okay, it was pretty mild in terms of the things that were being asked. And then reductions in energy use and increases in energy efficiency. So each state had the option to meet those state goals using these building blocks as they wanted, okay? In practice, some states did not have some choices. For example, California has already phased out coal plants. There's no coal plants in California anymore. So it means that they don't really have 4 building blocks. They have 3 at best, okay? But there was still enough here that there was something for everybody. So each state would find something that made sense. So that's gone now, or it's going to be gone. So what happens once the federal government gets out of this business, right? And where we withdraw from the Paris Agreement. By the way, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement is like Brexit. It's going to take a lot longer than people think. It's not, you know, it's not, there's laws in place. You know, we can't just go rogue and say we're out of it. So there are other things that are compensating for this. And I would argue that the Paris Agreement itself is a second best. It's not optimal. It has its limitations. And so maybe we can make up for the reduction in a commitment at the federal level by fostering these initiatives, okay? So some of these are relatively new. So the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, what they want to do is they essentially want to become signatories to the agreement themselves. So they want to, you know, places like Chicago. Chicago has a very ambitious climate action plan. Big cities throughout the world, they want to do something, they can become more active participants. The US Climate Alliance, there's states in the United States that are not convinced that withdrawing from the agreement is a good idea, right? And some of these states are further than others. RGGI, for example, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, involves a bunch of states in the Northeast, and RGGI is active in a carbon market. They have essentially self-imposed a cap on their own emissions. In RGGI, you can trade with other parties outside the region, but you know, this is happening, and it's getting, it's not going away because we have withdrawn or are withdrawing from the agreement. And then, of course, there's California. I put this up here because I want to remind everybody that climate is not a Democratic or Republican issue, okay? This guy here, as far as I know, is still a Republican and was a Republican in 2006 when he signed into law AB 32, Assembly Bill 32, that started this whole process of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in California. This guy here is most certainly not a Republican, okay? So I put this up here to remind us that there was a time not long ago when a Republican president, George Bush, did a lot for air quality and put together the first successful cap and trade market for air quality pretty much in the world, at that scale. So California is still going ahead. A lot of the things that California is doing are essentially prototyping and piloting things that can be replicated for the rest of the country. What about carbon markets? Carbon markets used to be the cornerstone of Kyoto. There was a lot of pushback. I still have nightmares about people saying tax and trade, which is not what cap and trade is, but you'll have to take my economics class to get the details on that, okay? In the Paris Agreement, you can still participate in markets if you want. Particularly this promoting the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions while fostering sustainable development. This is essentially what the clean development mechanism was in Kyoto that allowed developed or Annex 1 countries, allowed these countries to trade with developing or countries that were outside the cap, okay? So you can see here there's a variety of trading schemes in place and others that are being considered. So California and RGGI, the Europeans, and there are different sectors in these different markets that are in place that are included. So again, there is a wide flexibility in terms of how these are operated. It tends to be really very bottom-up rather than top-down. The Europeans, I don't want to harp on my, on continent, but the Europeans could have done a lot better with their trading scheme. The emission trading scheme in Europe is not faring very well because the cap was too loose. There were too many permits around. Essentially, the technology was developing faster than to reduce the pollution than people had foreseen. So what they should have done is tighten the cap and buy a lot of permits, and that was going to cost money, and the Europeans are broke. And so they decided not to do that, and so that was not very good for the ETS market in Europe. But the big thing here is that when there is a void, somebody will fill it. The United States has decided they don't want to play in this. The Chinese are. The Chinese have now plans in place to launch a national emission trading scheme, and more generally, they are becoming more, they're taking center stage in terms of greenhouse gas emissions for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, that there is that space now made available, but also their air quality is abysmal, and they're becoming richer. And so they see the value in reducing greenhouse gas emissions to the extent that there are co-benefits in reducing air pollution at home, okay? They don't burn coal, they reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they improve air quality in cities like Shanghai and Beijing, where people are not very happy, and they make good money, and they are part of the Chinese Communist Party, and they are being heard. The other part of the story is that, as I told you in the case of Europe, we are changing the cost structure of our energy sector. And so things like natural gas is becoming more cost competitive compared to coal. So we're already switching to a less polluting fossil fuel. And this is an American fossil fuel, so there is consensus to move ahead. But we're also increasing the other renewables. things like solar, wind, those things are becoming more cost competitive. They are spread all around the United States. It's not a coincidence that Iowa has a lot of wind power, right? This, again, is not a political issue. Renewables make economic sense. In Iowa, it's wind. In other parts of the country, it's solar. But the technology is doing what the White House doesn't want to do, okay? So some of this is happening regardless of our commitment. So the last thing I wanted to say was, these are all things that states, countries, cities can do. There are things that we can do ourselves, okay? We are still, developed countries and richer people in developed countries are still the largest emitters. This is globally, so that's doesn't necessarily get at us, but this does get at us, okay? So we are still emitting a lot, and there are ways to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by changing, for example, the way we eat, and not necessarily changing it in a drastic way. So my take-home message for all this is that America, as the federal government, may be out of Paris or on its way out of Paris. That doesn't mean that Americans are going to get out of Paris. That doesn't mean that American institutions at various levels are getting out of Paris. And there are a lot of reasons to hope that this is going to stick much better than Kyoto did. And I'm done.
So the library is recording this for their public channel, so I want to capture all your questions on microphone so it's captured on the recording, so you can just raise your hand, and I'll bring the mic to you. Go here first.
Thank you. Hi. My question is, I'm curious about emission trading systems and the transportation sector. How are these cap and trade systems, including non-point source emissions, in the system? I know cap and trade includes mostly power plants, from my understanding. So I'm curious how do you include the transportation sector in there too?
Well, you can essentially assign the emission cap to wholesalers. So you can do it before the gasoline gets distributed. You know, and some of these non-point sources are pretty point source CE. So for example, the American Airlines are really upset with the Europeans because they're being included in their ETS, right? And you could say a plane is not a point source, but really it's a pretty big, you know, non-point source. So there are the technology to essentially transform a non-point source into a point source is getting there. It's becoming cheaper to identify. You know, I don't. Maybe this is too big brothery, but I don't see it too far into the future where you could have some kind of thing in your car that tracks how far you have driven, and you could even have differentiated prices, right? Because depending on the time at which you emit your pollution, the cost of that pollution could change. So, I mean, Facebook, you know, is just paving the way for what's to come, you know.
Thank you. Would you expound a little bit on the evaluation process here with the Accord, with the Paris Accord? If a lot of the structure is bottom up, it's going to take a longer time to do any evaluation, and if there are varying timeframes from different countries, that's also going to have an impact. So is the evaluation done really by each country, or is there some overarching group that's looking at this?
That's a very good question. So for some of the things that are already in place, what has happened is the same thing that happened with the organic standards. There are third-party evaluators. If you look at the American Carbon Registry, for example, they are a third party. They go and measure the carbon emissions at the baseline, and then they go and measure the carbon emissions after the project is in place. So the way to do it, and this is very much still happening, but the way to do it, particularly with the conditional commitments, right, is if you're Norway and you're giving money to Madagascar to preserve a forest that's going to sequester so much carbon, is you separate the monitoring from the two parties. You give the authority to do that to an agency that specializes in that has remote sensing experts, that has forestry experts, and they do the certification. This is, so that you avoid the conflict of interest and you avoid, I'm Italian, I know what can happen if you, and you avoid the corruption of the integrity of the process.
Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask about, I don't know how much you kind of mentioned about the ratchet mechanism with the NDC resubmissions. And I think it was interesting the way that you spoke about the tightening of the institutional framework over time. How do you see that happening? Do you see that happening with like the Paris Agreement and the kind of articles like the rule book and stuff like that, and negotiations over that? Or do you see kind of new things that the UNFCCC can do? And then on the, I guess the non-state subnational actor submissions, yeah, I guess there are issues with that, like with additionality. So if the U.S. already has a pledge, then does it count if the, how much California is within the U.S., so it can't really contribute to the U.S. pledge. It's kind of a separate category. But with that kind of, I guess, what do you see in terms of, say, U.S. reentry and the starting point for negotiations around that in terms of, does the U.S. expect the world to be able to make certain kind of concessions to kind of keep where the agreement was when it was negotiated, or does the world expect the U.S. to come back with even kind of greater set of commitments and ambition?
Okay, so you asked a lot of questions. Let me start from the top, if I remember the first one. So I think that it's too early to say how the institutions are going to develop. I am trained as an economist. This irritates me because this is obviously not optimal. It's a hodgepodge, right? So to me, it's actually one of my students last year said, well, obviously what we need is, what's optimal is a carbon tax. And I'm like, yes, but we don't have a carbon tax. So in the real world, in the second best world, right, we do what we can. And so I'm just heartened that this is in place as opposed to what we had 6 years ago, which was, nothing was moving. Whether this gets done more with an umbrella framework under the aegis of the United Nations, or whether it becomes a bilateral or multilateral and bypasses more global agreements, I don't know. As long as something happens, as long as there is the goodwill to make something happen, I think that's a positive step. It's all what's your baseline, right? My baseline was no mitigation, all adaptation. We're going to go up to 4.5 degrees. So this is better than my baseline. In terms of what the U.S. cannot expect, in terms of additionality. Additionality is the real issue here, right? Because a lot of these targets, you could argue they're not additional. And by additionality, what he means is this is kind of like the big thing with forestry. If you weren't going to cut your forest, regardless, right? And you say, oh, you need to give me money not to cut my forest. That's what we call a paper trade, or money for nothing, because you were not going to do anything about it anyway, right? But we don't know that because we don't have the counterfactual. We only have one planet we live in, right? The planet with the policy. So we don't know what would have happened without the policy. So a lot of these things are not additional. And the determination of additionality is a process, right? So, Dr. Shortney is an engineer. He thinks about technology one way. I'm an economist. I think about technology another way. So if we can start figuring out what is additional in terms of better models, better tools, better simulations, that may help as well. So the third question about what the U.S. Is going to do if the U.S. comes back in. Allow me to be flippant. You gotta have the same policy for a week to be taken seriously. I don't see that happening right now, right? So, you know, I really hope that people in Iowa, in particular, because I live here, I have a degree from here, I have 2 children that were born here, that people understand that more droughts, more floods, all these things have an impact on our lives, and it's not a matter of a Democratic versus Republicans. And it's not, the science is not debatable. We don't need, I was reading today that they're talking again about the red team, blue team on climate change. The science is pretty set on what the problems are, and we have some tools to solve them. So I just hope that we do what we can at the scale where we can.
Thank you. State Representative Chuck Eisenhower from Dubuque. I don't want to flatter you by saying I came down here from Dubuque for this, but we got done early in Des Moines, and I'm on my way back home and saw this on my Facebook events and thought I'd stop by to let you know. You made reference in your presentation to the U.S. Climate Alliance. There are now 16 states involved in that. 16 states committed to doing their part to meet the climate accord, notwithstanding the fact that the United States is backing out of it. And we have introduced 7 of my colleagues. I'm ranking member on the Environmental Protection Committee, but my colleagues who are on the Economic Growth, Natural Resources, Commerce, Local Government, and Agriculture Committees introduced a resolution just this week laying out a case for Iowa becoming a part of the U.S. Climate Alliance and requesting that the governor, who has the power to do it, join the state of Iowa to that alliance. And part of it is, as you suggested, we were well on our way to putting the Clean Power Plan in place in this state. We've already done a lot of things to do our part, and we should join for no other reason to take credit for what we've already
Indeed.
done. But I think we can also learn from other states, and there's more we can do by learning from them. So Dr. Swertney's on the a group called the Iowa Energy Center Board, and he and the representatives, maybe from University of Northern Iowa, possibly Iowa State, we're going to see what we can do to put together a presentation for that body and others if they want to open it up, where some folks from the U.S. Climate Alliance have offered to come to Iowa and talk about what they're doing and what interaction there could be. So I have 10 copies of that resolution. If anybody wants to take a copy, maybe it wouldn't hurt for you to contact the governor's office and say, hey, you know, this is something you should look at.
Thank you, Sylvia, for excellent presentation. What is the impact of the U.S. pulling out on how seriously all the other countries are taking this?
I think that's a really good question, too. You know, we're going to rely on the Chinese for some of this because they're stepping up is really an indication that other powerful countries in the world take the agreement seriously. And it may be hard to see from this vantage point, but I went to high school with a guy from Portugal, you know, and Portugal has for several continuous weeks this past year only used renewable energy. In Europe, people are really stoked about this. They're really vested into the agreement. They're really vested into the institutions that the agreement is creating. So I think that the risk is more for developing countries because they are dependent financially for those conditional commitments on what comes out of the developed world. And so if the U.S. not helping out, that might be the kind of like, maybe not so apparent, but that may be a cost to the success of the agreement in the long run.
Thanks
Thanks, Silvia. I'm just wondering about your opinion of what the most important factor is for the United States continuing to reduce its CO2 emissions. And we're one of the few countries who has reduced CO2 emissions in recent years, and that's partly because of renewables, but almost the large part of it is substituting natural gas for coal.
Yes.
And how long can we, how dependent are we on continuing with that? And how successful do you think we might be, given the fact that people are manning the barricades to prevent natural gas pipelines from being built? We had an instant, Massachusetts had a cold snap, and because of the lack of natural gas pipeline capacity, they had to import a cargo of LNG from Russia last month. How important do you think natural gas is to U.S. strategy?
I think so. If history serves us, right, one of the early ways in which we reduced our intensity was to stop using oil, right, in the electricity generation business. So as I said yesterday to the biofuels crowd, there is no energy resource without negative externalities, except energy conservation, which does not have a lobbyist in Washington, right? So everything else we do is going to have some negative environmental consequences, whether it's hydropower and what it does to salmon in the Northwest, whether it's natural gas and what it does to, or may do to groundwater and earthquakes. And, I think we need to be upfront about and transparent about what those costs are. To me, the benefits of natural gas, particularly if we track methane emissions from throughout the process, and we take care of that, combined with the fact that, frankly, a lot of natural gas comes from red states, and so that makes it politically more palatable. Those benefits are undeniable, and I think that natural gas is a true bridge technology in terms of moving us to a more sustained renewables, where we have better batteries, where we have better ways to scale up.
Are you really saying this in Iowa City?
So that's my answer.
Can you quantify what the natural gas will do and batteries? Is there any reductions projected for the U.S. for those things?
Off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure that there are reductions associated with the increase in natural gas in the Energy Information Administration projection. The batteries, it's more long-term and more uncertain, and so I'm not sure that they include those in their projections. The natural gas, it's a technology that's ready to be stood up, right? The batteries, I don't know that that they've done the kind of like large-scale U.S.-wide analysis that they've done for ramping up natural gas production. The Energy Information Administration, by the way, is a jewel in terms of data, and science is based on the free availability of data, as I said yesterday, right? So I sure hope that all these research agencies remain non-partisan and that they do their analysis in a non-partisan way, because it's good stuff that they put out.
I'm sure you have a projection, though.
Oh, yeah, but that's not really my line of business. It would just you'll have to buy me a beer to hear that part of this thing.
All you need is a piece of paper, right?
Yeah. No, I'm not sure what the timeline for the batteries is. That's the thing. If the batteries come on board early, or if we scale up the kind of capacity we have faster, I think that Iowa could be 100% renewables you know, within the next 20 years. We have that capacity. You have to rebuild the grid, but I think it could be done. Don't quote me. Don't quote me.
Might be too late.
I'm an optimist that way. Thank you.